On a desolate farm, the protagonist Joe practices basic French before preparing his shotgun. Suddenly, a cuffed and hooded man appears and is promptly shot in this futuristic world. Joe explains that though time travel doesn't exist yet, it will be invented in the future and immediately outlawed. Facing challenges in disposing of bodies without evidence, criminal organizations send targets back in time for loopers like Joe to kill and dispose of, with payments attached to the targets. Joe then navigates a depraved city, exchanging the silver pieces he collected at the looper headquarters. Driving his luxury car through scenes of carnage in the impoverished city, Joe stands out, embodying a stark contrast to his surroundings. Joe encounters his friend Seth, who is berating a homeless man. With Seth's motorcycle broken down, he asks Joe for a ride. During the journey, Seth showcases a unique ability, a TK mutation that allows him to make small objects float. Approximately 10% of the population possesses this impractical yet intriguing skill. Inside a building, they join their co-workers and learn that Zach is closing his loop. Joe explains the dangerous practice of criminals sending future loopers back to eliminate their older selves. This final job brings a substantial payday, but the catch is a reduced lifespan of only 30 years. After celebrating the night away, Joe continues his routine of practicing French and carrying out his hits, amassing wealth. Concerns arise among his co-workers due to an unusual surge in closed loops. While asleep, Joe is startled by a rapid knock on his window. It's Seth. Seth rushes in, panicked, and Joe presses him for details. Seth discloses that he was sent from the future that day, but refuses to close his loop, letting his future self escape. He reveals the looming threat of the rainmaker, a ruthless boss closing all the loops. A bang at the door announces the arrival of Looper Kid Blue and others, demanding entry, suspecting Seth's presence. Begging for his life, Seth implores Joe for help, who conceals him in a secret hole beneath the carpet. The armed men enter, searching the apartment with suspicion. Leaving a guard behind, they take Joe to Abe, the boss. In the meeting, Joe narrates Abe's origin as a future arrival tasked with running the loopers, who later formed his criminal empire. Abe forces Joe into a tough choice: surrender Seth or lose half his savings, a painful dilemma as Joe dreams of going to France, a desire Abe exploits. Against his own will, Joe reveals Seth's location to the loopers, leading to the capture of future Seth, now on the run. Discovering a scarred message on his arm, future Seth realizes that the loopers can torture him, altering his future. While driving to a meeting, he loses fingers, feet, and nose, eventually crashing. Crawling to the building, he pleads for his life but is shot in the head upon entry. Meanwhile, younger Seth undergoes surgery. Later, Joe, burdened by guilt, notices his tardy target is his future self. In a moment of inaction, the future self overpowers Joe, rendering him unconscious. Upon awakening, Joe finds a note instructing him to run, returning to a ransacked apartment. Confronting Kid Blue and another looper stealing his money, Joe locks Kid Blue in a safe, vowing to fix the situation by finding and killing his future self. He leaps out of the window amidst gunfire, and the narrative loops back to the earlier events. Joe waits for his target, and this time, upon its arrival, he decides to end his loop by killing his future self. Realizing his employment is complete, he takes his savings and begins a life in China. A decade later, his desired lifestyle depletes his savings, leading him to join organized crime under the Chinese mafia. After 13 more years, he meets and marries a woman, settling into a new life. In his 30th year, 3 men capture Joe, anticipating his inevitable return to the past for execution. Joe prevails against them, enters the time machine, and arrives in the past, overpowering his past self and escaping. After robbing a convenience store for supplies and a coat, he starts receiving memories from his past self. Tracking down his location, Joe kills a looper in a car and witnesses his former self being targeted, promptly eliminating 2 more loopers. After dragging himself to safety, Joe causes panic at looper headquarters. Injured Kid Blue informs Abe that he can resolve the situation. Meanwhile, Joe wakes up and returns to the city, determined to find his future self. Future Joe, engrossed in a computer-like projector, works to locate 3 children, his motivation unclear. A message on his arm prompts a meeting with his past self at a diner. The next day, the 2 Joes engage in an aggressive conversation. Past Joe insists it's time for his future self to surrender, but future Joe, claiming past Joe as a child, shares details of his future life, including meeting his wife. He reveals that when the loopers came for him, they killed her. Armed with the rainmaker's identifying coordinates, Joe plans to locate and eliminate him. Before he becomes the rainmaker and commits future atrocities, Joe, fueled by the conversation, reaches for his gun, but is swiftly halted. Future Joe seizes the opportunity, using the gun to eliminate an approaching looper. Younger Joe snatches one of the coordinates, sparking a sudden influx of loopers. In the ensuing chaos, past Joe and the other loopers open fire on future Joe, who narrowly escapes into the fields. Undeterred, the remaining loopers, led by Kid Blue, pursue present Joe. Quick thinking allows Joe to evade them on a bike through a cornfield, consulting the coordinates he obtained. Meanwhile, Sarah, a woman with a child named Sid, notices Joe and brandishes a gun, warning him to stay away. In the cornfield, Joe contemplates a strategy while back at Looper headquarters. Kid Blue faces reprimands, losing his gun, enduring a beating from Abe, and being ordered to stay away from the mission. On the farm, a vagrant enters the property, prompting Sarah to grab her gun. In her attempt to subdue the man, she trips and loses control of the weapon. Joe intervenes, assisting her and scaring the vagrant away. However, Joe succumbs to withdrawal, collapsing and seeking water. Sid, the child, assists while Sarah instructs Joe to return to bed. Sid remains curious about Joe, asking questions. Simultaneously, future Joe evades authorities, struggling to retain memories of his wife, which are gradually replaced by thoughts of Sarah. Back at the farm, Joe wakes up to find himself imprisoned. Sarah, armed with a gun, releases him but demands that he leave. Joe insists he can't, and after a heated argument, Sarah shoots him with a buckshot. Pressing for an explanation, Joe confesses he's a looper and warns that someone from the future is coming to kill her son. Realizing the severity, Sarah allows him to stay for protection. Meanwhile, future Joe identifies the first child he's been searching for, and with a heavy heart, clandestinely removes him from the property. Believing that killing the rainmaker will reunite him with his wife, Joe grapples with the moral implications of such an act. At the farm, Sarah begins to trust Joe, allowing him to stay. However, she insists that he keeps his distance from Sid. In the middle of the night, Sid wakes Joe, inviting him inside for a conversation. Joe uncovers Sid's exceptional intelligence and discovers Sarah isn't Sid's biological mother. Sid recalls witnessing his mother's death as an infant. Future Joe skillfully evades intense pursuit by loopers. The next morning, Sarah reprimands Joe for talking to Sid, claiming maternal authority. Sid's memories contradict, prompting Joe to encourage dialogue. But Sarah resists, telling him to mind his own business. Later, Sid purposely provokes Sarah during math puzzles, leading to an argument. Sid's anger erupts in a room-shaking scream, prompting Sarah to lock herself in a safe. When Sid calms down, remorseful, Sarah re-enters, and they embrace, his earlier hurtful words forgiven. In the city, future Joe observes a woman and her child through a window, preparing for an impending strike. Amidst this, a knock interrupts Sarah, revealing Looper Jesse. Armed and apologetic, Jesse questions her solitude. Claiming a returning husband, Sarah deflects, as past Joe stealthily avoids detection. Jesse sifts through pictures, asking about the Joes. Sarah feigns ignorance. Past Joe maneuvers, staying concealed. Unaware, Jesse sits in the living room. Sid intervenes, guiding Joe to an escape tunnel. In this refuge, Joe shares his past, disclosing abandonment by his mother, leading to life as a looper. Witnessing Jesse's departure, Sid embraces Sarah. Simultaneously, Kid Blue tracks future Joe, acquiring footage of him stalking a mother and child. That night, Joe discovers Sarah's potent telekinetic abilities. Sarah, trusting Joe, reveals that the man seeking her son is his future self, expressing confidence in Joe's willingness to eliminate him. Sarah discloses her regret over giving Sid to her sister at birth, expressing a determination to care for him regardless of his feelings. The next morning, Jesse points a gun at Sarah's head. Joe proposes a deal, offering half his silver to help him kill his future self, but Jesse insists he gets in the car. As Sid appears on the stairs, frightened and causing objects to shake and float, Sarah grabs Joe and they flee from the house. Sid uses his telekinetic powers to levitate Jesse, ultimately killing him and causing extensive damage to the house. Joe rushes back inside, realizing Sid's TK mutation marks him as the rainmaker. He informs Sarah that Sid will become a mass murderer, prompting her to plead for Sid's life. Despite this, Joe heads into the cornfield in search of Sid, discovering him covered in blood and hunched over. Unable to harm the child, Joe comforts Sid, who reciprocates the embrace. Instructing Sarah to flee in the truck with Sid, Joe warns of his future self and other loopers' imminent arrival. Simultaneously, future Joe infiltrates the target's house, anticipating the child's presence. Kid Blue, armed with a stun gun, incapacitates future Joe at the looper hideout. Despite Kid Blue's boasts, Joe seizes an opportunity, grabbing a gun and shooting Kid Blue and another captor. Dual-wielding a machine gun, he clears the base, eliminating loopers. Confronted by 9 loopers outside a door, Joe disposes of them swiftly with a grenade, opening his escape route. Advancing to Abe's office, Joe receives a begrudging compliment from the man, acknowledging his significant progress. Kid Blue, barely holding on, regains consciousness to find everyone, including Abe, dead. Consulting a map, he deduces Joe's destination and heads for the farm. On the road, both Joe and his loop encounter future Joe, who discloses the demise of the loopers and his newfound freedom. Defiant, Joe refuses to let him harm the boy. As tensions rise, Kid Blue intervenes, knocking young Joe down. A fierce exchange of gunfire ensues, reminiscent of a game of chicken. In a decisive move, Joe eliminates Kid Blue, realizing his loop is no more. With Sid in peril, Joe races to reach Sarah and Sid before it's too late. Joe Loop intercepts, opening fire and prompting Sid to panic, flipping the car. Sarah and Sid flee, and Joe continues shooting, managing to graze Sid's cheek. However, this only infuriates Sid, leading him to telekinetically lift both Joe and his mother and wreak havoc in the cornfield. As Sid is on the brink of harming future Joe, his mother calms him down, and he sets them both down. Sarah urgently instructs Sid to run into the field, blocking future Joe's aim. In desperation, future Joe shouts at her to move. Observing this from the road, young Joe takes decisive action. Before his loop can harm the child or Sarah, he puts the gun to his chest and fires, causing his loop to vanish. Sid runs back out of the cornfield, and his relieved mother concludes that the threat is over. The movie ends with a sleeping Sid, and his mother hopes that Joe's actions have changed his future.